countries which are essentially empires in scale, whether they are the United States or Brazil or elsewhere. There are also cultural factors of which we're all very well aware. There may also be considerations about which we could not do anything even if we wished. If you ask yourself, what is it that the various countries that have a system of welfare that we associate with social democracy, what do they have in common? Of course, if you think of the list I gave you, your first thought would be that in order to have successful social democracy, you need a large number of people who are able to do cross-country skiing. But it's not by chance that the kinds of system that I'm going to talk about this evening are most successfully implanted in small, homogeneous countries. Scandinavia, Austria, the Netherlands, to take the best-known cases. In these countries, issues of trust, issues of acceptance of a willingness to pay for other people's services, whether in your own generation or in a future generation, it's closely connected with the assumption that they will do the same for you and your children because they are, as it were, like you. And it's not accidental that social democracy and enthusiasm for the welfare state has declined in countries like the Netherlands with the rise of multicultural communities and considerable suspicion about the willingness of others, minorities, to look different and sound different, to behave in the ways that the homogeneous white Protestant community has done for decades before. We don't have that kind of country here, and that may be a consideration. It may also be the case, and I'll come back to this, that social democracy and the welfare states, that they're not quite the same thing, do face real practical problems today, which make them difficult to imagine in the future, not only if you're American, but also for Europeans. But I want to look at a slightly different question, and that is the very difficulty we have in even posing the question of how should we imagine a different sort of society? How should we imagine a different set of collective arrangements to mutual advantage? I want to argue that our problem is not sociological, it's not economic. It is, if you like, forgive me this academic phraseology, discursive. We don't know how to talk about these things anymore. To do this, I want to go back a little in time. And I have on my side Maynard Keynes, whom I shall quote once or twice this evening, who famously wrote that a study of the history of opinion is a necessary preliminary to emancipation of the mind. So to emancipate our minds this evening, I want to study for a minute the history of an opinion. The opinion I have in mind, of course, is what you might call economism, the way we talk about public affairs today. For the last 30 years, in this country, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in general in the English-speaking world, to a much lesser extent in continental Europe and elsewhere, we have lost the capacity to think of public affairs except in, and in a very restricted sense, in economic terms. When we ask of a policy or a proposal, is it good or bad? We don't actually ask, is it good or bad? We ask, is it efficient? Is it productive? Would it benefit gross domestic product? Would it be inefficient in that respect? Would it contribute or not contribute to growth and so on? We ask, in a very restricted sense, economic questions. We talk economics as a language of public policy. That is not a natural condition. It's an acquired one. It's not the first time that people have done this. In 1905, the great William Beveridge, who 40 years later would go on to found the British welfare state, gave a lecture in Oxford where he asked why it was that political philosophy had been obscured in public debates by classical economics. That obscuring of political thought by economic language happened again in the 1920s, and it has happened to us. And it's been going on for a while now, so we've lost, many of us, the capacity to realize that is in fact an acquired condition. It's not, by the way that the great classical economists themselves used to think and talk. If you go back to the 18th or 19th century, considerations of ethics, of what Adam Smith called moral sentiment, were uppermost in economic conversations. And indeed, the idea that we might reduce public debate, public policy considerations, to purely financial or economic calculations was already in the 18th century something that worried the more perceptive observers of the early years of capitalism. Condorcet, the Marquis de Condorcet, in the late 18th century in France, shortly before the Revolution, expressed to him the horrifying thought, and I quote, that liberty will be no more in the eyes of an avid nation, he meant France, than the necessary condition for the security of financial operations. The idea, in short, that we would mistake the freedom to make money for freedom itself. How did we come to think in exclusively economic terms, such that when we have a purportedly national debate about whether or not we should fix our collective arrangements for healthcare, we can only ask, how much will it cost? Who will pay? How much are we willing to sacrifice? And will it be efficient? Rather than, is it good? Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it bad? Is it just? Is it fair? I think I can answer the question. We live, all of us, in the long shadow of a debate that most people in this room will be quite unfamiliar with. If you ask yourself, who are the founding fathers of American and English economic thought today? They are, depending on which particular aspect you look at, 5 men, some of whom will be familiar to you here. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Joseph Schumpeter, Karl Popper, and Peter Drucker. Drucker, a management guru of enormous significance and influence in the 60s, 50s and 60s and 70s in this country. Popper, the great theorist of the open society and its enemies and of totalitarianism. Hayek, the founding father of, as it were, the Chicago School of Economics. Mises, his colleague. Schumpeter, the theorist of creative destruction in capitalism. All 5 of these men were born within, forgive me, a short train journey of Vienna. 4 of them were born in Vienna, one of them in Moravia, a few dozen miles to the north. They were all influenced, shaken up by the interwar catastrophe that hit Austria. And little Austria is the source of much of the way we think and fail to think in public life today. Because what happened in interwar Austria was, firstly, of course, the catastrophe of World War I, then a socialist experiment in Vienna, and then progressively a reactionary response to that experiment, and eventually, of course, the Nazi takeover, 1938. All of these men were refugees from that experience, and all of them, Hayek especially, the most influential of them all, cast their thought in terms of a question: why did liberal society fall, fail, collapse in the face of the challenge of totalitarianism and give way to the extreme right in that case, in the Austrian case? Their answer was because of the unsuccessful attempts by the left to introduce state-directed planning, state-directed services, state-led economic activity, and so forth. That, in other words, the great collapse of European civilization, that for them was the defining quality of the 20th century, the defining question of the 20th century, had been brought about by the failure of the left, first to achieve its objectives, and then to defend liberalism against its failed objectives. And their conclusion was, quite simply, that in future, the best defense of liberalism, the best defense of an open society, the best defense of freedom would be to keep government away from the economy. If you kept government away from the economy, if you kept politicians away from planning, regulation, direction, however well-intentioned, left-wing socialist, social democratic plans to improve society, then you would not open the path to totalitarians of right or left, and you could protect the liberal heritage that they had seen crumble before their eyes, before they fled to America, to England, to New Zealand in Popper's case. Now, there was another person who responded to this same challenge from a different angle. Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, was born in 1883, the same year as Schumpeter. Keynes grew up in a stable, secure, confident, safe, prosperous, powerful England. And he watched in World War I, and after the war, and into the 30s, as that culture, that economy, that society collapsed and declined and fell, and all the certainties of his culture, his class, fell with them. Keynes responded to the same questions that Hayek and his Austrian colleagues